Shrayana, we met more than a decade ago in Cambridge in 2010, and I have been hearing about this book for a very long time, since you've been writing it for, I believe, 15 years. And when I heard that it was like actually coming out this year, and I reached out to you to say, let's do an event in Bangalore. There were a couple of reasons I really wanted you to come here, and we're excited that it's actually the first event and the book launched yesterday. So one is because though those of us who are in the economics community or spend a lot of time on data and statistics are aware of the dire state of gender relations and metrics around women in India compared even to other developing countries, I do feel those issues are barely discussed in policy or media circles, and your book really attracts attention to all of those facts and in a way that can be, so that message is heard more. But also because of the number of voices you've got in this book, which, as I told you, I'm really impressed at the range from Gujarat to small towns in UP to the tribals of Jharkhand to Lutyens, Delhi. And because you've written it in a way that other people will read it, as Ravi was saying, it's a clickbait title and already a best-selling book. So, you have a busy job, a day job at the World Bank. What led you to spend your free time writing this book?
Well, firstly, Janhavi, thank you for conceptualizing the idea of doing this event. This is incredibly exotic, seeing people physically in a space, and thank you so much to all of those who came and the BIC team for organizing all of this. Janhavi, honestly, I wish I could tell you that I wrote the book with some grand design in mind. I didn't. The book completely happened as a series of accidents over which then I was able to overlay some structure and purpose. In 2006, I was in my early 20s. I just finished studying economics in the traditional way they teach you in Delhi University. And I was sent to different communities. I was working with this organization called the Institute of Social Studies Trust. It was set up by Devki Jain, an organization focused on thinking about women and women's labor issues. We were doing a project with SEVA, which is one of the largest labor unions in the world, in fact, for women workers. And I was sent to a low-income community. What was a slum then is no longer a slum now, in Ahmedabad. And I was excited. I designed a questionnaire. I believed in the cult of data. I was ready to go and ask people all kinds of questions about their wages, working conditions, and I was convinced that I would save the country through all the data that eventually I would collect. And when I went to these areas as a young, foolish, very young, foolish research assistant, what I found was a series of women who just stared at me blank. They were agarbatti workers who were making agarbattis and incense sticks at home for large-scale contractors, earning maybe a quarter of minimum wage per month, and yet they were choosing to work. All these women were also involved in actively fighting for their own labor rights. So they were unionizing, they were fighting for wages. They were very much aware of their own economic deprivations and realities. They didn't need a researcher coming in from the outside to ask them these questions to remind them. And so they were bored. And the one thing I don't want people to do, I don't want to waste people's time, and I don't want people to be bored of my questions, or at least what I'm trying to talk to them about. And so we started taking, I think, in survey questionnaires and methods they teach you, you take a research recess. So you stop talking about the formal questions that you've been asked, and you just start chatting. And usually it's cricket. At that time, it was also the Miss India pageant, and then there was Bollywood. And we started talking about actors that we liked mutually. And there was only one man that everyone seemed to mention everywhere I went, starting with Ahmedabad to rural Uttar Pradesh, then to Jharkhand, and that was actor Shah Rukh Khan. And what I noticed was the moment we started talking about Mr. Khan, the tone, the texture of the conversations just opened up. It was a very different way of engaging with each other. We started talking about something that we felt connected to, And when I asked these women, oh, well, you like Shah Rukh, and what movie do you like? Turned out none of these women had actually ever even watched a full-length film of his, which is a privilege in this country. We should remember, according to the last National Family Health Survey, only 8% of women in this country report watching a film in a month. That's the state of the latest data that we have. And so unsurprisingly, these women knew their songs, they knew interviews or snippets of pictures that they had seen, but nobody had actually watched a film. And that, in a way, I stumbled upon this, that as you started to talk about Mr. Khan, we started talking about their economic struggles, because immediately then the next question was, well, let me tell you how hard it is for me to watch a film. And those were questions that these women were much more interested in talking to me about, and at least that's the sense I got, than the traditional tell me just your wages and your working conditions. We got to that, but Mr. Khan helped. And I think what happened after that, Janhavi, was something, I think, shifted in me, and I decided that I wanted to follow this story. And everywhere I went, unsurprisingly, I found his fans. And two things I realized over a decade of just talking to these women each time Mr. Khan had a release, we'd chat during festivals, unsurprisingly, because many of the big releases for Bollywood happen around festival season. And one of the things that really struck me was fandom. You know, we think of it as just a simple personal preference, it's just your taste. But actually fandom is fundamentally an economic activity. To follow the work of an artist, to unambiguously adore the work of an artist, requires free time, money, leisure, and these are actually commodities and goods that most women in our country scarcely have. And immediately from fandom, it became a way to safely enter very difficult conversations around how do you interact with markets, how do you interact with money, how do you interact with men, because almost immediately what happened was, because of Mr. Khan's persona, not only then were we talking about the economy and earning money to watch him or to find free time to watch him or to listen to a song, we immediately then went to the interpersonal dimensions, because everywhere I went, particularly in, you know, the chapter in rural Uttar Pradesh, everywhere I went, there was this complaint that men are like Salman, but we would prefer Shah Rukh, you know, and it struck me, and immediately this went into a much more accessible conversation about masculinity. What does it mean? What is this crisis of masculinity, which I would argue, and I think many of us here know, has just now reached epic proportions in our country? What is the shape of that, and what is this idealized, desired male that many of these women seem to want and really struggle to have? And I think the last thing I will say, Janhavi, was, so there was an accident, and then I think I followed up somewhat diligently. And on a personal note, sometime around 2013, and I write about this in the book, I had my heart smashed myself. And somehow in that period of feeling somewhat tinged with one's own personal life, I wanted to escape into a Shah Rukh film. And around 2013, he was doing extremely hyper-masculine films. He was doing Chennai Express. And that again stirred in me this idea that I wanted to go back to many of the women I'd met in 2006 all the way, you know, till 2013, and just check up on what did they think about Chennai Express. Were they as disappointed with it as I was, and where were their lives? And so I went back during that period between 2013 to 2017, and it was a very difficult time in the economy as well, just with what's happening to women and jobs. And all of that, in a way, found its way into the narratives. And what I was very committed to, Janhavi, I think to answer your question about gender and development, and I think what Ravi said as well, is that the economy is not GDP growth. It's none of that. The best economists know the economy is our social relationships, it's human interaction, it's our moods, it's our predilections. And I really wanted to tell a story. When I looked at all the interviews and all the transcripts, and it was a lot, I have had no social life as a consequence because I've been doing this. What I realized when I was looking at these notes is that this was a very intimate telling of what the period between liberalization and lockdown has felt like for a very diverse group of women. And the economy, I say this in the book, the economy has a very rich, emotional, and ethical life. And the reason these women were trying to find money was not just for money per se, but to actually want to watch something for their own pleasure, to support their own families, to feel meaningful, to feel dignified. And I think there's a way economists write about the economy, and Amit is, I think, somewhere here, and then we were talking about, he's a professor at APU, we were talking about the traditional way economics is supposed to be written, and I was tired of those rules, and I wanted to tell a much more people sense of what the economy felt like, and felt was the emphasis, and I think that's where the story began, and then I followed up.
The book has a wonderful title. Now, obviously, the two of you have set the context for it, but I'm going to prod you a little bit on the title. For those of you who haven't read the book yet and you're about to read the book, there was this time between, let's say, 2000 to 2010 when there were a lot of India books coming out, because this was a time of optimism, happiness, people were expecting great things to happen in the country. And, wonderful books came out in that time. Shrayana's book is an India book that's also not an India book, because it's a much more sobering affair, and it's also focused on this huge segment of women. And the title, and I know a lot of people in the audience probably have questions on the title. We were discussing downstairs with somebody about how desperately seeking Shah Rukh, India's lonely young women and the search for intimacy and independence, as you just hinted, is not something you necessarily get out of the World Bank economist CV. But I'm going to prod you a little bit on this idea of the lonely young woman. Who exactly are you talking about? And what is this loneliness that captures your attention and which sort of runs through the book?
Thanks, Manu. Manu, one of the things that really struck me when I was talking to these women, and they come from very diverse communities. I think Janhavi hinted at that. There's Rajput women who you think live lives of luxury, but actually when you read the stories, you'll realize these are extremely violent lives. I say there's a lot of violence beneath the chiffon saris that one sees. And there are tribal domestic workers moving from Jharkhand to Delhi, but they were all lonely, and I would contend that beneath the crisis of jobs for women, there's a crisis of love. And what I mean by that is economists such as Sendil Mullainathan have this wonderful framework. He calls it hidden taxes. The idea is that women not working is not just because of infrastructure or policy or large innovations or what's happening just to the macroeconomic framework. Those are important. But one of the things that economists have increasingly been very interested in is this idea that we are imposing emotional costs and nuisance on people when they do things that society or economic frameworks don't really want them to do. It's not desirable behavior as per society. And I would argue, and one of the themes that's running through the book is, I think, women working outside the home for various reasons to do with caste, class, safety, notions of social scripts of what womanhood should be like. I would argue that women stepping out of the home, earning an independent income, increasing their own bargaining power, is something that society at large and families and communities, in at least the cases that I've observed and followed over this past decade, they would prefer women to be indoors and adhere to traditional matrimony and motherhood. And there's a tremendous amount of loneliness when you decide not to do that. And that loneliness is not just a statistic, because I think many of us know that women in the workforce are one of the most meager minorities in India right now. We've had sharp drops when it comes to women's employment in India. It's only stabilized right about now, but there are lots of questions about whether the data is actually comparable with previous rounds. And between the period of 2004, 2005 to 2017, we've just seen the sharpest drop globally, and we're in the bottom 5 when it comes to women's economic participation. So they're lonely in the workforce, and they're lonely because of these hidden taxes. And it was that loneliness that I was trying to capture, or at least tell a story of, because again, as I said in the beginning, I think the economy is also structuring and shaping some of that loneliness and loss that you feel. And the last thing I will say is they're also lonely in the kitchen. And what I mean by that is, if you look at global reports, India right now, along with South Korea and Pakistan and a few countries, are in the bottom 5 when it comes to the share of men who help with housework. And so it's loneliness which is structurally coded, and it's loneliness because many of these working women are doing things, they're defying norms, and there is a nuisance and loneliness that's attached to that.
Which is why some of them like Shah Rukh Khan, because in some of his movies, he's in the kitchen helping the women, trying to impress them and sort of, be part of their space. And Shrayana's got these wonderful turns of phrase in the book. There's this one bit where she talks about women who do manage to get a job, who do manage to move out into the world and occupy space in economic areas. They have to juggle dignity, deadlines, and dishes. And there's a bunch of these wonderful quotable quotes in the book. And yeah, Shah Rukh Khan, of course, is always through it. She has these amazing ways by which she links Shah Rukh Khan into the conversation.
You know, I think just picking up on that, Manu, one thing I did want to highlight is a lot of people have been asking me of late, so is the book about an actor? And no, it's not about the actor, because I think the actor himself will tell his own story. But what I was very interested in, particularly in the way I think nonfiction is written around that post-liberalization period, and I think this may go back to what you were saying about the India book and so on, is often, I think we write a lot about sort of, when you think about the economy, it's a lot of powerful, important men writing about the economy. And I think it's very useful literature. It tends to be men because of the nature of economics as a profession. And you also have lots of stories about great men. And Shah Rukh Khan is certainly a great man of the post-liberalization era. There's no denying that. I think the cultural footprint that he has. But what I was interested in was to tell you a story about, well, what does that icon of that great man, what stories does he allow us to tell about ourselves? And I think to me, that is the power of Mr. Khan, which is that each one of the women in the book, they're actually relating to him from very different places. As you read the book and you have a sense of, someone sees him as the aspiration of sort of middle-class social mobility, right? And rivalry in a very petty sense. There are women who see him as the masculine ideal because he's kind, you know, all the warm feelings, constantly speaking his feelings, finding masculine strength is just talking about what he feels and about love, which is very distinct from very oppressive environments these women were living in. And I think the power of him is not only does he provide you escape, at least the women in the book, not only does he provide them escape, fun, comfort, but he starts to provide different scripts of how, if you're feeling taxed by society, how can men help women when they start to do some of the things that perhaps families themselves are not comfortable with? And I think he was mirroring that and modeling that for them.
And you also have a line where you say that for a lot of women who don't have access to feminist language, to the jargon, to the framework that we would define as feminist, for them, he is a source by which they can express themselves using him as a medium to communicate something.
In fact, one of the things which really struck me in your book is the point at which you say that for those of us who are aware of 1991 and Manmohan Singh's speech, then we talk of Shah Rukh Khan as a post-liberalization icon. But if you are from the community of women or populations that haven't heard all that, then Shah Rukh Khan was liberalization. The 90s movies he starred in, the entrance of posh, you know, well, Scottish mansions near Chandni Chowk and so forth was liberalization. Just to pick up on a couple of things you and Manu were talking of, one of the things I appreciate so much in your book is that you've used Shah Rukh Khan to give all the women in your story a level playing field, whether that be, well, the elite women who are in this room or yourself or women across socioeconomic criteria. And as part of that level playing field, what you quote about what Sendhil said about that women's efforts are heavily emotionally taxed. That is something we all experience. We experience it as well, that you work outside the home, you're judged for not being with your child. You're single, you're judged for not being married. Your choices are heavily emotionally taxed by society. So a part of your book that really struck me, I think I have a couple of favorite characters. One is the accountant, a young woman from Rohtas Nagar, I believe, who is a bureaucrat in the Delhi government and chooses to stay single in her 30s of choice. And Manju, a young Muslim woman from Rampur in Uttar Pradesh. And both the two of them, as well as many of the other women you portray, repeatedly make this point that their access to leisure is heavily curtailed. They deeply resent it, especially when it is obvious to them how unfair that is with relation to their brothers, cousins, and the boys in their life. That a boy can go on a motorbike, on a highway, on a joyride anytime, can see Salman movies, but Manju's desire to once see Veer Zara at an Eid's release is curtailed by her father and brothers to the point that she recalls it 3 years later. And we see that in South India as well, if you travel to South India, that boys loitering is a common sight. Women and girls have no free time. I think that comes up repeatedly in your book.
Yeah, there's a quote in the book, which I think is Jiddu Krishnamurthy's quote. He says, you can only learn if you have leisure. And one of the things I realized when I was following these women, and if you look at the data, because there is actual representative, claims to be representative statistical data on women's time, and urban working women are also doing 4 hours of housework. Men do 29 minutes, something like that. That's the gap. And many of the women I followed, I actually asked them one day, just keep a diary. If you can, indulge me. And some did. And unsurprisingly, they were involved in mothering, cooking, caring. And men, I think their involvement perhaps in housework was limited to in upper classes to giving the driver some instructions or, so on and so forth. And I think that gap in not having enough time to just yourself, let alone watch movies. And I experienced it actually even as a research assistant early on, because these women barely had time for my questions, let alone, for Shah Rukh or for anyone else. And I was struck at not only the data, but also how this was essentially being mirrored and also demonstrated in the conversations I was having, because they were always rushed. And whereas if I wanted to interview some of the men in this landscape, it was easier because they had routinized time for sitting together with friends, talking about politics, smoking a cigarette, things like that. Whereas for women, it was much, much more difficult. Having said that though, Janhavi, I will say, I think, and I make this point in the chapter on rural Uttar Pradesh in this district called Rampur, which is, they call it a minority concentration district because it's significantly Muslim in its demographic. And what was interesting when I was speaking to communities there is that it seems that schooling, public schooling, really changed the dynamic of gendered resentment, because what it did was a lot of young girls were suddenly, once in a while, they would be outside the home. And when you would go to school together, you would see that boys could be out playing together, just socializing, being easy with one's body and oneself, whereas these girls never had that option. And I have a line in the book where I say, well, Manju, who's my principal character, and there's a reason why she calls herself Manju, you'll have to read the book to know, and her mother is much more peaceful and at peace with the fact that women have to maintain parda, you need to seek permission always to go outside the home. Manju was not. She was constantly rebelling, desperate to taste the world outside. And when you read her story, you'll see what ends up happening, because she does end up tasting the world outside, and that has its own repercussions. And these women were not willing to now sit still and just be witness to boys having a certain kind of freedom. They were agentic beings. They were out trying to seek their own leisure, no matter what the circumstances were, and fighting for it. Whereas the generation before, who I think didn't mingle as much with just the freedoms that boys enjoy out in public, because their lives were even more restricted, they didn't feel that sense of resentment. And I think with leisure, there was this sense that I really do feel public schooling much more commingling, which happened in that phase, particularly because of Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan and its previous avatar, the district school education programs. It just created that dynamic even, in small hamlets, at least that I was visiting.
Just a quick thing, related to this, you're talking about the younger girls going off to school and then coming up, with a response to this. But there's Zahira in your book who talks, and she gives you this line where she says, all this empowerment, Shahastikaran is good in English language reports. I've learned these words through our meetings at the office, but in life, things are more complicated. You need peace in families. Where she's an older generation person, economic crisis and has compelled her to go out and, seek economic freedom and have an income. But she still has to deal with the husband in the home. And you've got this fascinating session on how the older generation of women have they have to walk this tightrope between keeping peace in the kitchen, in the house, but also seeking economic agency and trying to balance both, which is obviously the mothers of these girls going to school.
And it's interesting, which is that I think there's a very strong parallel to that also with the icons that they love. Because in the book, you'll see I follow obviously a group of women, and then some of them have daughters, and they feature in the book through conversations that we've had through these years. What's fascinating is the mothers adore Mr. Khan as a representative of the benevolent patriarch. He will take care of you. He will essentially be a good husband and a good provider. Whereas the younger women in the book, they don't want to marry Shah Rukh. I actually say this, they want to be him. They want his, the money he earns, the success he has, his freedom, what he represents to them is very different generationally. And in fact, between Zahira and her daughter, Meenal, who's a character in the book as well, these are women I met in Ahmedabad, right up in the beginning, this is 2006. Meenal was 10 years old then, and now is a grown woman. And her story is in the book. And what's fascinating fascinating to me is they reacted to Shah Rukh very differently, precisely because they saw what the role of women in society can be, and their, the possibility and potential for women very differently.
And one of these women even talks about how you have to make your peace with beatings and things like that. And I remember, I'm only mentioning this because there was a comment on social media when there was an excerpt from your book out, and somebody was very offended where you have a sentence where, there are these women who even make their peace with the stalker side of Shah Rukh Khan, the certain characters he played. And this person was very offended. But in the book, you actually explain that this is again part of that negotiation, part of that, walking that tightrope.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's remarkable the extent and the duration you followed these families, to start with Zahira, and 15 years later you're still writing about them and her daughter's attitude to Shah Rukh. It strikes me, as you said in your book, that the older women accept that this is the way of life, that life is unfair, but all the younger women consistently resent that their brothers have so much more freedom than they do. I think Lily, one of the Christian tribals in the Jharkhand, said the same thing, that our grandmothers were at peace with the forests, but I've been to Delhi and I'm not.
Yeah. And, economists tend to focus on these notions of bargaining power within households. And one of the things that there's large literature in economics on, and I reference it in the book and try and make it more accessible for those who don't come from, I think, an economics background, which is the more resources you have access to outside the home, the more power you will have in the way these economists define it within the home, which means that men tend to have more power within a household in societies like ours because they can exit the household anytime they want and they can find a job, they can access public space. Whereas if a woman, and I think in Zahira's case, this is what had happened, for a woman to essentially step out and say, I will be a single female household, who will even rent a house to you? Where will you find this house from? Are you able to actually seek support from your family itself? Will they support you? And in the book, there are stories and cases where they don't. And I sense that the reason why I was interested in what was happening in the interpersonal and home dynamics was because the economy and the way women were interacting with jobs had so much to do with their say within the household. And I think younger women, the daughter of Zahira, certainly saw that her mother, once she was out in the world and she starts earning her own money and assumes a certain station and stature within her community, her daughter was then very keen to essentially build on that even further. And I think this is, it's true for all of us. And I think that's a theme that runs through.
The Zahira wants the daughter to marry a nice man like Shah Rukh Khan and just settle nicely instead of,
Manu,
more adventurous with.
Manu, one thing I will say is the tyranny of marriage, and there's so much data that shows marriage is what tends to just push women out of jobs. And there are reasons for that. These are not, I don't want to sort of make it sound, as if we're sitting here in judgment to people who make certain choices that they do, and I think that's fine, but the book tries to give you a texture of what those choices feel like, and are they really choices? Because maybe the social dice is just so loaded against the choice to want to continue working that you will retreat eventually into the home. And I think in Zahira's case, the reason she's saying that, and she told me, one of the things I have to confess is I think the reason why a lot of these women, particularly from low-income communities, the middle class, indulged me and my project for such a long time, and I think they were happy to talk about Shah Rukh, they love talking about, I think they liked the space to talk about themselves as well, but a lot of it was a pity for me because they felt that, well, no one's marrying you and you have this project and maybe we should just play along and chat at some point. And at some point, this will come through. Some of them actually, I think, are connected today as well. And it's a product of their generosity, but also a little bit of their pity. And I think marriage and the tyranny of marriage is an organizing principle of female selfhood in our societies. That continues. Between 1990 to 2021, I don't see in the things that I'm hearing people say, even amongst the upper class, and there's an entire section of the book which is about elite women, upper middle class women. In fact, I'd argue that in there, the suffocating nature of you have to get married and otherwise your life will begin once you get married, that continues. That has not changed at all.
Since you did bring it up, it is true that every chapter of the book, whichever region of India, they all asked you, but why you were single?
Yeah,
all of these
I
women.
couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape my singlehood. I thought this was a project I would nurture as well to essentially, it's a passion project. And everywhere I went, people essentially, and it was fair because if people are sharing their personal lives with me, it's fair for them to ask as well. And one of the things, I think many people who do research, and particularly anthropologists and sociologists will know this, it's very natural in most communities, certainly in North India and in Jharkhand, for people to just talk about their marriages and ask you about your marriage, and it's sort of a very open thing, and in fact they find it very surprising that you're being guarded about it. And I think the conversation just flowed from there. It was the most natural thing. I met one of the people I follow, I think Janhavi mentioned her name's Lily in the book. She's a Christian tribal domestic worker, moved from Jharkhand to work for a posh expat in Jorbagh in Delhi. I met him after multiple years, and she saw me, and the first thing she asked me was, are you married? And puzzled at why that hadn't happened. And then she said, well, let's talk about what's going on. And then we started talking about what was happening with her, which is also a fascinating story. But it was just the most natural thing, because it is, as I said to Manu, it is such a fundamental principle, the way female selfhood is organized.
To be fair though, I'm now 31 years old, which means other than my grandmother, 20 other people have started asking me whether I'm married or not. So I think we're all stuck in that trap to a certain extent.
Yeah, but I do think that the financial and what Sandal would call the hidden taxes and just the economic taxes, because at the end of the day, a woman living on her own, even if it's in Bombay, and I think all of us know stories about this, finding a place to stay, even for me as a single woman, finding a place to stay in very nice neighborhoods in Delhi can be very difficult. For women from other communities and class backgrounds struggle even more. And I think what's actually remarkable about, I find, if I can say so, about the women in the book is that not one of them feels defeated by these circumstances or structures. In fact, you realize that agency is defined in very different ways depending on how bounded or suffocating the circumstances might be. You will find strength in it, and you will find a way. One of my favorite characters, in fact, in the book, and I think she's definitely connected today, is I call her a Rajput philosopher, and she's essentially a woman from a Rajput background, married into a very conservative family, wanted to actually study philosophy and become an academic in Chicago. She had a picture of Martha Nussbaum right next to a picture of Shah Rukh. Like, those were her ideals and idols. And she was very upset when her family said, well, no, but you need to get married. Her father was in debt. There was a long history of the family having to marry the women off by a certain age, and that had implications for the social standing of this particular family. She came from Raipur. And what she ends up doing, as you'll hopefully see in the book, is she negotiates singledom within marriage, because she doesn't really have a particularly loving or happy marriage with her husband. And what she ends up figuring out is, economists would call these separate spheres, where you almost lead independent lives within the household. And hers is a really beautiful example of that, where essentially she navigates to, I call her single within her marriage. She leads her own life, and her husband leads her own, and they have a peaceful equilibrium. On the outside, we wouldn't think of that as resistance or, particularly remarkable as a phenomena. But I thought once I heard her story, there was something really remarkable in the way she actually goes about negotiating this.
A reading? Yes. I would pick maybe something from Manju's chapter. I told she's one of my favorites. One of the reasons is her sass. When you asked her, she had an arranged marriage, and you blurted out, what was the words you used in the book? That, so how is your husband? And she was like, so how is yours?
What would you like me to read? Something
The chapter where on boredom, maybe.
Okay. I actually don't have...
Or the one from the accountant, otherwise, where...
Can we do gold? Maybe, I know you got some comments. Do you want to say something?
Yeah.
You will read in the
Okay. Actually, I'm going to do, we'll get to Manju and the accountant. What I'll do is I want to read a chapter, a small section from a chapter about a girl called Gold. She's a runaway. She ran away from her house in Jaisalmer and ran away initially to become briefly a model, and then she trained through her brother providing her financing to train as an in-flight attendant, and she ends up doing very well, and she worked for a while. But she moved moved to Delhi, which is where her airline hub was. And this is actually very true of lots of jobs in the service sector, hospitality and aviation. Once jobs in these sectors started to boom because of reform in the late 90s, a lot of young men and women were disembedded from their community structures of how to find love, marriage, because suddenly they were all mingling. So here was a girl who was from Jaisalmer, she was living in Delhi. There were other men from all these other small towns and some even villages who'd studied, had jobs in hotels or airlines, and they were all usually living nearby each other and they all mingled. And they created, I think, what some sociologists would call a self-regulating market for love, because they were trying to find partners as opposed to going through the typical arranged marriage route. But the market was brutal and particularly loaded, I think, against a lot of the women who were in there for reasons to do with just the body and safety and men having certain options. And so I'll read a short bit about Gold, where I'm just summarizing how she's feeling about the market for love. As Gold gave up on her family, she wanted desperately to make one of her own. I thought I had to leave my family because I did not want to marry and have children with someone they chose, but now I can't seem to find anyone to make a new family with myself, she said. I never thought it would be this hard. I think I'm just angry at myself. It was an anger Gold eventually came to terms with. She befriended her rage, taking it with her to dinner and clubs. Her anger at her father had forced a departure from Jaisalmer, but love made her angrier, the sheer inequality of the business of loving. But Gold could not run away from romance. She knew that the market for love, this whole heterosexual mating game, was a profoundly unequal space in which a young, straight, attractive, and accomplished Indian man operated with the complete certainty that no matter how his body or prospects changed, there would always be a young, attractive, accomplished woman waiting to give birth to his children. It felt to Gold like men, and only men, were free to date as they chose, either widely and indiscriminately, or by committing to a series of monogamous relationships. Men would arrive at romantic encounters, their confidence cemented in this fact, always comparing Gold to their past and future possibilities. Sometimes, she said, when I'm out with a new boy or talking to him, she told me, I felt like I'm not just with him, but I'm with all the other girls he could be talking to as well. I feel like I need to be better than all of them if I have to have any chance of getting him. And I'm always aware that he has options. I reminded Gold that she had options too, given how men would respond to her. She smiled and thanked me for the compliment. I know many people are interested in me, but the thing is, I don't want to date too many boys. Men don't like it when a girl has an ex-boyfriend because they feel they are competing with that ex of hers. They always think girls with more than one ex are boy crazy, and then the good men won't be interested. I don't want to go through too many options in public. The fewer, the better. The more men you try to make things work with, the more of a failure you seem. Everyone is suspicious of girls like that, and our worlds are still very small. Everyone knows everyone, and news of people's past relationships travels very quickly. And the more gossip about you, the lesser your chances of finding someone good and decent. So I have to be careful, she shrugged her shoulders. It's not like other countries where you can try as many people as you like they show in that show Friends. We have rules here, and they exist only for girls.
You know, this friends thing comes up in another segment in Gold's chapter as well, where she's using it to learn English and all the lingo and all of that, so she can participate in the world that she's now part of, having come off from Jaisalmer and become airline crew and all of that. But the other thing about the book, and this chapter encapsulates that really well, is how you discuss how liberalization, economic freedom, and access also means there's greater sexual autonomy and agency for a lot of these women, which also, in some ways, Gold, for example, she's not ashamed of it. She knows society will extract something from her, but she's not ashamed of it. She's not going to give it up either. And you've got this wonderful blurb at the back of the book from Devki Jain, and it reminded me, I was reading Devki Jain's autobiography, and she talks about some of these things way back from the 50s and 60s. And you see there's a certain naivety in that generation. You know, she's fighting similar battles. She's gone out there, you know, to find her own place in the world all those decades ago. She gets married in her 30s. She talks about how she's had 2 abortions. Quite a remarkable book. And yet there's a naivety, yet there's a certain lack of certainty about what exactly a woman wants. Whereas as you come to this post-liberalization generation, there's a great deal of sexual confidence that appears as well. Also that leads to men having a kind of crisis within.
You know, Manu, and I think this is when we would say it's a market that was created, right? Suddenly there were all these single people who were essentially interacting, and there were no rules of interaction. Gold would constantly complain to me, and this was fascinating. I write about this in the book, and in fact, to me, the only way to do this faithfully was actually to write it up as an interview text, which is what is there in the book. You'll see it. She used to say to me that, well, I left Jaisalmer because I didn't want my family to pick my husband, and yet I've come here and I'm trying to find someone on my own, but I want the same protections that my family gave me. And she actually said that family is like the police. So if a boy that you're trying to sort of have a relationship with or is supposed to be married to you through an arranged marriage network, if he misbehaves, if he's cheating on you, or if there's violence, the family will step in as a form of insurance. And censure on the boy, and there will be repercussions later. Yet, when you think about what's happening now in Gurgaon, which is where she was, there are men and women mingling and she used to say, our parents will never meet until it's serious, and serious usually means marriage. And what that led to was abortions, where women were essentially completely, exclusively responsible for their sexual hygiene. Men would run away at the notion of even buying a condom, let alone like any other form of sexual contraception involved. And you have to see that and when I call it a brutal market, I think it is brutal because of just the onus that is placed on women to be beautiful, to manage your own sexual health, and men have fewer compulsions. And the judgment on men, as you see, as I read in the chapter, is far lesser when it comes to, playing the field. And she has this beautiful line where she says, because she was not a sexual Puritan at all, she said, there's nothing wrong with playing the field, but you have to play the field with honesty. And what she would complain about is that many of these men would have multiple partners, but they would never tell each other that this is how they were navigating their romantic lives. And as a consequence, women would end up feeling very shortchanged. And this would not happen in reverse because of just the structure of what we talked about. And I think, going back to what you were saying about Devki and where we've traveled, while there is certainly far more freedom when it comes to the fact that this market now exists in certain atomistic areas because of certain kinds of jobs. Also, it's now much more possible to just go meet someone at a cafe. I mean, we realize many of these things didn't exist prior to that period. It's not only just social sanction, but this physical spaces, right? Like people drinking cappuccinos together, which was actually quite a novelty in Gold's family. And what was fascinating to me was, despite the fact that this structure now exists to try and find your own mate, and now, of course, things have changed even more. I mean, now we have apps and so on. The book, none of the characters in the book use these apps yet, because I think it stops at a certain point beyond which I think the apps really became amplified. But what I will say is that these women were still willing to incur the tax and the cost of their sexual agency. None of them wanted to be protected. Gold certainly did not want to be protected. What she was asking for is what she would call emotional hygiene, which is be honest and be faithful about what you're saying. And yet, I think because of also the economic imbalance between men and women, and the fact society doesn't censure men as much as women when it comes to playing the field, meeting different people, exploring different relationships, she was always feeling like she was getting shortchanged in that process.
There's this, if I can just read a few lines, there's this wonderful paragraph where she talks about how gold picks up sexiness as a kind of means to navigate this new world. And she says, fitness and cosmetics conferred sexual confidence. Makeup transformed gold. It wasn't merely a physical transformation. She applied concealer on her spirit, hoping to camouflage all her self-doubt with sexiness and cosmetic poise. Sexiness required a rigid routine, waking up at 4 in the morning for her 1-hour run, no matter where she was. Almonds, dhania water steeped overnight, morning potions and lotions, heavy vitamin intake, meticulously researched, portioned, planned and prepared salads for lunch, buttermilk at 11, aloe water at noon, coconut water at 3, tulsi water at 4, green juices for dinner, boxing training at gym combined with Pilates, yoga in the evenings, nighttime lotions and potions, turmeric rose, full body, Opta, whatever that is, on Saturdays, fruit masks on Sundays, weekly salon visits, Cosmopolitan for sex positions, American TV and films for an education in contemporary attitudes and language, wax strips for the soul. Yeah. It's a wonderful paragraph.
Thank you. Gold is, thank you. Thanks. I will just say one thing, and because this also costs a lot of money. I mean, if you just heard everything that Manu just read, she was burning through her savings. And briefly, she has this beautiful, I mean, everyone has theories in life, and I feel like the book is actually just full of different people and their theories of how life operates. She starts dating a Frenchman, and she has all these theories about Europe and what Europeans are like. And she has first heard of Europe because of Shah Rukh, because DDLJ and Europe had become synonymous with husbands and all of that, and that train ride that they take in that film. And she was barely able to save, because the business of beauty and maintaining beauty is such an expensive enterprise. And this is an in-flight attendant. She was earning well, but she would be in that middle class, the sort of around, what is it? Essentially the next 20% after the top 10% in our wealth distribution. And she barely had any savings, and she desperately also needed to get married, because she realized that she was, in trying to find a husband on her own terms, she was also ending up squandering a lot of what she had earned, but she felt it was for the right purposes. And you'll have to read the chapter to see what ends up happening. Does she find her happy ending?
But I noticed about Gold that though she resents the very unfair and brutal mating market she's in, and including a lot of her anecdotes about her French ex-boyfriend, at no point did she regret the choice. And it was a very filmy choice. There was a marriage arranged for her, and she actively left in the middle of the night in order to not marry that man. And that, despite all her frustrations with what she picked instead, she never regrets the choice to prioritize her own agency over the choices her family would have made for her. So, Shrayana, I know you're going to do a lot of events in Bombay and Delhi and so forth coming up, but this is your first event, and it's in Bangalore. So I did want to highlight a paragraph on the book on South India. It struck me quite strongly. So this is from the same person I mentioned earlier, an accountant. She's from Rohtas Nagar, and she works in the Delhi government, and she eventually chooses to be single. So I'll just quote here that, and she would tell Shrayana a lot about her, and one of the reasons she chooses not to get married is she never agreed. Every set of people she's introduced to, I mean, specifically she says that, as you write, that as a result in all her interactions with matchmakers and interested families, she was expected to give up her job despite its stability and relative prestige. After they check on our plans to work outside the home, the accountant would tell me about the questions posed by prospective in-laws. They always ask us how well we can cook. And the paragraph goes on like this at some point, and as you say, that everything the accountant told you about marriage was in the form of a cautionary tale. And then she says that, can you imagine a world in which we refuse to marry men who can't cook for themselves? If we asked the boy's family if he could cook, if men were tested as much as women are, very few people would get married. Or maybe boys would learn to take care of themselves. It's happening with the IT programmers from the South. My friend says that those boys are better able to cook and clean as they have lived on their own in other countries. But those stories are rare. And who will let a Banya girl marry a boy from the South anyway? Who will let us move to the South? And this paragraph struck me on many counts. I mean, I've grown up in South India. My friends are I'm South Indian in many ways. My friends are South Indian. And to some extent, this may be stereotyping. If you look at data indicators, the gap between the South and the North is not as the way it's idealized. But it also struck me because of the number of times I have heard the opposite from Bangalore friends, that, it's kind of colloquialism that, don't marry into a North Indian family is the reverse.
And one of the things, Janhavi, that really struck me about that is there's an exoticization, at least. So the accountant she comes from, the way the book is structured is it's divided based on groups of women and where they are in the wealth distribution. And unsurprisingly, the wealth distribution correlates very closely to caste divisions as well. So the first section of the book tends to be upper caste, elite women. The second is sort of the first generation of the middle class from more conservative trader caste and business caste families, which is where the accountant comes from. And her father would step into her room while she would be trying to write notes about Shah Rukh's interviews, because she was obsessed with Shah Rukh Khan's interviews. She, in fact, improved her English by listening to him recite his interviews constantly. And he would constantly just come into the room to check on what she was doing. And there was a deep dissatisfaction. I actually say in the book that he thought of Mr. Khan as a pollutant in his home that needed to be extinguished and just removed somehow. And she came from an extremely caste conservative family. And I think the fact is that given caste is so closely correlated to these choices of women's mobility, we are so obsessed with female sexuality because there are norms of caste purity that are playing out. And as a consequence, when she says, who will let her move? I mean, not only is this a concern about letting girls just leave their colonies and their neighborhoods, and in her case, and go to another state, but also the fact that all the men that she was being introduced to, you had to maintain community norms and marry within the context of your caste group. And in fact, even in Gold's chapter, and Gold and the accountant are essentially in the same milieu, it's very similar. And this complete obsession with purity of caste related to women's bodies is the reason why she's so frustrated. But I will say there is an exoticization of the South, because if you right now look at women's employment rates, the female employment rate of Kerala is actually very close to the female employment rate of Rajasthan, which I'm surprised that we don't talk about it much more, given that the two states are supposed to be structurally so different when it comes to women. But increasingly, I fully agree with what you said, Janhavi, increasingly actually this idea of the North-South, and of course the South is different, and as you said, don't marry into the North, but if you look at a lot of statistics, particularly on women's participation in the economy, increasingly you're seeing lots of states in the North and the South are starting to show very similar numbers, and that's very worrying.
Where perhaps there is a difference, somebody recently told me that India is a land of 25 countries, and the South is like Japan, where total fertility rates are cratering because South Indian women are more educated. I think education metrics are quite different, and they very clearly recognize the career consequences of children are so high that very few have children and many have one, if at all. What is the time? I felt like none of us have.
Got about 15 minutes, I think, left.
Another 10 minutes.
10.
Okay. So
I have a quick thing, when Janhavi was talking, I was reminded of this thing my grandmother told me. This is from the 60s. I was stunned how she had my mother. It was a very difficult pregnancy. And then she told my grandfather, look, this is it. I'm not having any more children. Birth control pills. You better find them from somewhere and get it. And he was like, fine. And she was a really naive woman. I can have very free conversations with her. She had a sister who was 13 years older than her. And this is that naivety of that generation. The sister got married, went to her husband's place, and every time she would come back, she would be pregnant. So my grandmother had internalized the idea that when you go to your husband's house, something in the climate there makes you pregnant, and then you come back. And like Devki Jain, well into her 20s, at the time she got married, she had no idea how these things operated. Then, of course, she got pregnant, had my mother, and then she realized, oh my God, this is not at all fun. It's quite painful, and I don't want to do this again. And my grandfather, because she was able to voice that so clearly, and because he was clearly a very decent man for that time, he said, okay, fine, no kids. It took 7 years before he came to her and said, look, our daughter's growing up alone. Maybe one sibling will be a good idea. And at that point, grandmother said, but you're asking me so well, so politely and sweetly, I might as well say yes. So then they ended up having my aunt. But the thing is, as I was reading your book, and this is again the North-South thing, right? My grandmother despises Shah Rukh Khan. She thinks he's not hairy enough, not masculine enough, doesn't have a Misha and all of that. But the same impulse exists in her. The person she idolizes, she's desperately seeking Mohanlal, not Shah Rukh Khan.
You and I talked about this, I think, Manu. I really sincerely hope that if this book encourages a certain kind of conversation, it's about this idea that what do our icons allow us to say about ourselves? I certainly think there should be a desperately seeking Mammootty, Mohanlal. And in fact, one of the things I discovered, the book starts, in fact, in Kochi, because if you look at, I analyzed Google Trends of where Shah Rukh is being searched the most on Google. And surprisingly, Kochi, West Bengal, Andaman, Nicobar Islands, and then parts of Kerala are where he's being very much searched. And I went to an internet, like a cafe which is run by the government. It's part of a digital literacy initiative. full of young men. And I asked them, so, you know, who's your favorite actor? Nobody mentions Shah Rukh because, and then they said, oh, we're good Malayali men. We don't watch Hindi films. They're so unsophisticated and uncouth. And then they said to me, and this was what was fascinating to me, is that then they said, but, you know, we watch him because it's instructive for interviews. And then they smiled and said, girls like him. And I did find several young women, and then, you know, I mentioned them in the book. But I think going back to this idea of the book is not, it's structured around what conversations I think Mr. Khan allowed us to have about men, money, misogyny, very difficult terms, and negotiating those terms within your own families. Because the one thing I think from the book that's very clear, and this is true I think for a lot of literature on women's movements and so on, is that the family is the fulcrum of social discrimination, particularly I think the way the Hindu family in a certain way operates. And trying to attack that, that's actually what all these women in the book are doing in their own ways. And in trying to attack that, you're essentially bearing the moral burden of propelling some kind of social change in your immediate, intimate environment. It's very difficult to do. I think it's exhausting. And in that environment, what you want is ideally someone who is supportive, or just I think the soppy, cartoonish songs with the wide open arms and all the, you know, the utterances may seem foolish to many of us who are rational and sensible. But I think when you're dealing with that much pressure and that burden, you do want to escape. And that escape, in this case, in the stories I tell, is Mr. Khan. It could be someone else of another generation. I argue that actually a lot of the younger women now, I argue that the next Mr. Khan is female. She probably is from this city. And I think that, you know, you're looking for someone who will essentially allow you to escape or give you comfort or help you articulate some experience. And I think when they saw Mr. Khan and the model of masculinity he represents, it's as your grandmom was saying, you asked me so nicely. So many women in the book constantly said to me, well, he speaks with so much tamiz. You know, it's a word that keeps coming up. And you realize when you're saying that, and then immediately the next question is, but then why do you feel in your immediate life men don't speak to you well? And then they'll explain to you that people, men, and even their own families, it's not just about male and female, but the way the family is treating these younger women, you want comfort, you want escape. And in this case, it's Mr. Khan.
My final question, since we're running out of time, is there's a lot of you in the book. Was that scary, firstly? Because, you know, I wouldn't dare do that. There's so much of your experience, your heartbreaks, your own sort of idolization of Shah Rukh Khan. When did you first see Shah Rukh Khan, and has there been a subsequent meeting? Because you write about that.
I will tell you about the story when I met Shah Rukh, but I will close on that note. But before that, I do want to say, it was actually a very delicate balance, and I'm curious to hear what people make of it when they read the book, which is, I didn't want to write this book where there was this social, because there is anyway such a tremendous social distance between me and many of the women that I was writing about. And one of the things that was very particular and very important to me was, if I was going to try and tell a story about how women have experienced the economy, but at the intimate side of what that meant, I wanted it to be a cross-class story. And I needed to be then present and open to it, because I didn't want this cool analytical distance between me and many of the people I was talking about, because these are actually very close relationships that have built over a very long period of time. And I also felt I wanted to blend this writing of the personal and the economic, which is very important to me, and I think that was an interesting thing for me to try and do. And so it was a delicate balance between not trying to impose oneself on the narrative and yet be present, so that you're not hiding. I'm not hiding behind the voice of a narrator who's telling someone else's story. I'm present in the book. And that was important.
And in a sense, you're also not othering these women. Exactly. You're sort of equal to them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so many of them, we will never be equal. Sadly, that's, I think, the current circumstances. But perhaps it's my guilt also about the fact that we're not equal, that I felt that if I was going to write this story about how other people were experiencing their personal lives and their relationships, I also needed to be a bit honest about why is it that Mr. Khan was appealing to me, because that's what united us in conversation. And I felt that was an honest thing to do in the book, as opposed to just keeping this distant gaze. I will tell you the Shah Rukh story just when we close, unless we close right now.
I think we have disproportionately focused on the more elite or even middle-class women in this book, but I don't want to give the impression, I mean, I think we biased to the first half of the book and it's struck, but I do want the audience to be aware that, you know, there are a huge number of interviews of women from farmer working class communities, tribal communities, from slums in various localities. And just as we hand it over to the audience, I told you if I had to pick one film that was my favorite of Shah Rukh Khan's, it would be Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, and that comes across as the fan favorite across communities, across generations. What do you think is so appealing as we hand it over to the audience?
Well, you know, the one thing that film actually taught me, everywhere I went, it was everyone's favorite film. There was not even a contest. And yet everybody saw that film so differently. So one of the women Manju, I mentioned, from rural Rampur, she thought of it as, you know, this man who's just so, well, later beautiful when she sort of grew up, but earlier she thought of him as just this kind, energetic figure who was jumping and dancing, and she went and recreated the jumping and dancing for her brothers in her home, much to their chagrin. And whereas later, in fact, Manju, when she gets married, and there are certain things that happen in her life, which I don't want to give away, you should hopefully read the book. We talk about the fact, you know, many English-speaking fans would tell me, well, DDLJ is a very toxic film. It's very patriarchal because of that fundamental question of Raj, who's the principal character along with Simran, chooses to not run away with her. And he says, I will wait for your father to give me approval of our marriage. And many people would say, well, that's very patriarchal. It's this, you know, again, this obsession with father's approval. And when Manju was telling me about the movie, she actually pointed to exactly that scene, and she said, well, that tells me he really cares about her. And I said, but what do you mean? And she said, well, if a girl runs away from her family, and she's thinking of northern India, Uttar Pradesh, unsafe for women, if things don't work out with the man and her family has abandoned her, where will she go? She will have no backup, no exit option. Where will she find safety and security? So to her, the very same scene that many of my friends and many of us may think of as patriarchal, toxic, those kinds of words, she saw, in fact, as a sign of someone who truly, genuinely cared for a woman. And I think what I learned about DDLJ, and there's so much mention of it in the book, is that different people, then the gaze is very different based on, obviously, your circumstances and where you come from.
We'll start taking audience questions now, but do you want to tell us about when you met Shah Rukh Khan?
Embarrassing, but I'll share it anyway, and it might give you a hint of why this book has reached the stage that it has, and it's taken me this long. The film Devdas had come out in Delhi, and I was going through, you know, the typical. I realized amongst a lot of sort of upper middle class elite fans, you know, fandom was a way to escape dipping grades, questions about not feeling good about yourself. You just wanted to escape and carve an identity for yourself, which was very different. And so I think I was going through one of these phases, and I was following what Mr. Khan was doing. He was at PVR Cinemas for an interview on Devdas, and I showed up with a very dear friend of mine who's in this room today. And we wanted to go and try at least see him, and there was a security guard, and he just looked and he said, what's wrong with you girls? I mean, he's just an actor, leave him alone. He was a jarred, burly security man who did not want us to go in. And then I pleaded, I said, please, you know, I just want to see him once, I'm a big fan, all of that. I was very young, I would like everyone to know. And he looked at me, I think, again, out of sheer pity, and he said, fine, you can go in and you can see him. And then there was this rush to sort of get us autograph. And I felt like, well, if I'm here, I'm going to try and get an autograph. And so there's a whole group of people trying to find Mr. Khan just to get an autograph. And I looked at him, and I remember, I'll never forget, I said, well, you know, could you sign? And he said, well, next time. And I said, but there'll never be a next time. And he said, inshallah, there will be a next time. And I think perhaps it's in service of next time that
that's why the book got written. All right, I think we'll take audience questions now.
I want to ask about ground reality uncles, which you mentioned.
I'm going to get into so much trouble, I think, as more people start to read the book. Ravi, should we do one question or? Okay, super. In the book, in the first section of the book, I talk about just, you know, when middle-class people, very educated people who read the New York Times and the Economist, tend to talk about women's employment issues. And one of the things that's really struck me is that, the kind of outrage we see about innocuous advertisements and really silly things, we never see that level of mass outrage about the level of female employment in this country. You don't see protests of that kind. You don't see that kind of anger. It's just, I think we've internalized status quo that much. And I go to many times, because I'm quite a socially awkward person, as I think some of you can probably tell. Often I don't have much to say to people other than numbers about what's happening in the labor market, or I talk about Shah Rukh Khan. And in this case, there's a typical kind of person I often meet in Delhi drawing rooms, largely. And I call them ground reality uncles, because even if you give them data, and I've spent, I think, more than 10 years researching women's jobs, but they will still have the civilizational confidence to turn around and say, but beta, I will tell you, let me explain to you what is happening. Aap samajh rahi nahi hai. Let me tell you ground reality. So I call them ground reality uncles, and they feature in the book quite strongly. And there's a conversation between myself and a historian at a Delhi event. Please read it, because I actually use that section to also give you, as the reader, a flavor of what's happened to the labor market statistics. And I thought that was a more interesting way to introduce the statistics in a more accessible manner, because I actually often find myself mentioning these statistics to ground reality uncles, and they always have a set of questions, which I think anyone would have, about how the data is collected, but are you sure? And I try and respond to that. But I hope there are no ground reality uncles in Bangalore.
She was very careful to say she meets them in Delhi drawing rooms, to not offend anyone here.
No, but Janhavi, there is a very peculiar Delhi kind of masculinity. There is, and I think maybe my next book will be on that. But it has its own unique sense and structure.
She did mention historians, so I would be worried for some of them here.
I can assure you.
We have some questions online. Lekha, if you could read them out.
Yes, Priyanka Varma asks, when we deal with patriarchy, do you think tribal Dalit women in your book had greater access to public life as they went out of home to earn money, and therefore have more freedom than urban upper-class women?
That's such a great question, because when I started to think about the structure of the book, I had some very traditional tropes in my mind. Although I'd read literature, I'd sort of been extremely influenced by it, I still thought that my own milieu was much more free than women from more marginalized communities. And yet, I think at the end of this book, the sense I actually have is of deep despondence, certainly when it comes to, I think, sadly, my own milieu. Because if you look at what's happened in India, economists call it the income effect, and some call it also the Sanskritization effect, drawing on work from sociologists, which is this idea that as incomes have grown in communities, female job rates have also fallen precisely, and they're correlated. And one of the arguments that's made is, as post-liberalizations, as families have started to earn more money, and it's largely upper caste families that have made much more money than certain other OBCs and upper caste families, they've withdrawn women, and they've been able to almost purchase conservative values. So they've withdrawn women from the workforce. Whereas when I look at a Lily, or I think of women from much more harsh circumstances, I'm thinking particularly of Manju and various others, while the economic circumstances are obviously much more harsh and they're leading lives in far more constrained environments, the desire to want to actually resist in small ways, in different ways, is much stronger. At least that's the sense I get. And I can't speak for grand, what's happening across the country. I can only speak of the stories that I intimately know, and the stories that I'm aware of, and the data that I'm aware of from the government statistics. And what seems to be the case is actually female employment amongst upper castes is low. It's lower than other communities. And one of the fears that many sociologists have and demographers when it comes to women's employment is many lower caste groups, once they start to earn more money, there's this idea of adopting many of the models and practices of upper caste groups as well. So there's, again, a withdrawal of women back into the home. And so it almost seems like, with almost the sex-selective abortion story, that you see it in high-income areas, you're also seeing with female employment, upper caste groups more homes that are well off. I'll give you a statistics, it's in the book. At the end, there's a series of tables, which I really hope at the end of the book should just make everyone cry because they're just so incredibly sad. In the top 10% of urban India, only 6.5% of married women work outside the home. And this is the richest 10%. And the data comes from CMIE, which tends to do a better job of representing upper class groups as well. And that should horrify us, and yet it doesn't. And I think the fact that it's unfair actually is much more prominent. The notion that it is unfair amongst Dalit communities, amongst Santhali women, certainly, that women should be out and working because the norms are very different. Yeah.
Hema Malini has a question. Clearly there's a theme here. Why is amusement such a strong way to address this aspect of marriage, I'm assuming, and how women deal with the tyranny of it? Why is amusement such a strong way to address this aspect of marriage and how women deal with the tyranny of it? This question came in earlier in the conversation.
I think you've answered this in some detail.
I think so. I mean, to me, I think one of the things is I think marriage is deeply tied up with also just economic exit. So for a person like me who is financially independent, the option of sort of opting out of that practice is possible. It's economically possible. And I pay for it. I pay higher rent to live in an area, even in Delhi, which is safe with a certain kind of lifestyle. And to me, actually, the social norms, the durability of them, and the link with jobs and the meaning and the space that an independent income provide are very deeply tied with notions of marriage and buying into traditional matrimony as well.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating talk. I'm curious about the next generation, right? So you spoke about lockdown to liberalization to lockdown, right? I'm curious about what the next generation is going to look like when we have OTTs, we have social media. I mean, the act of watching a movie, the sort of associational life that happens as a consequence of seeing a movie is very different from, more atomized type of interaction we have with our devices, right? So I'm curious, how do you think that might change the way women interact with each other and with men and with anyone else in society?
There's an entire section, in fact, in the book. One of the women I follow in the book is a part-time Bengali domestic worker who lives in Delhi, and she works in a Bengali neighborhood in Delhi, and her daughter spends too much time on the phone. And it's not her phone, it's her brother's phone. And that, by the way, speaks to huge gaps in access to technology, the internet, communication devices. And India is actually one of the countries which reports one of the highest gaps when it comes to women accessing mobile phones relative to men. And she begs and borrows this phone from her brother to watch Priyanka Chopra's Instagram feed. That's actually what she does most of the time. And so while I think the possibility, based on the stories one's heard, the possibility is tremendous because female self-expression on the internet, I mean, the possibilities are remarkable. I call it it's like a lookbook of global femininity, right? Because she's going through all these different accounts of different people. And suddenly, I actually say what Shah Rukh did for her mother, all these next generation Instagram influencers are doing for her, because she's seeing these women behave in very different ways. And Shah Rukh introduced London and Europe to her mother through the images that she had seen. And now on the internet, this young girl is looking at Priyanka Chopra, sunning herself somewhere and wondering, well, I mean, I may not be sunning myself, but surely I can also go out and have fun and live life on my own terms. And so I think that the possibility is tremendous, and yet access continues to be a problem, particularly for women. And the last thing I will say on this is, I'm convinced when it comes to the next generation, I actually say this in the book, there's a huge generational shift, which is all the older women that I followed are all Shah Rukh fans. All the younger women I follow love Deepika Padukone or Priyanka Chopra. To them, now female achievement and autonomy are represented in these female fans, which is why I say, I think the next Mr. Khan is female. And these women actually have completely redefined, if you look at the way femininity is presented, because they talk about boyfriends, they openly acknowledge their relationships. There's no shame about it. And younger girls in the slums of Delhi are looking at this on their phone, or once in a while happening to see it on a TV, and are realizing, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing if I have a boyfriend and I just live on my own. And they see these women and their economic success and they aspire to it as well. And so I think the possibilities are tremendous, but access will continue to be an issue. And I suspect that that's where policy, innovations, and just low-scale products will be very important for women to just have more access at home.
And you mentioned in the book that the widest gender gap globally is, there's a big risk that the fact that India has the largest gender gap in access to mobiles could actually entrench social divides.
I do, but my sense is actually that there's churn there, and I don't want all of us to sort of feel like it's this gloom and doom picture. Not at all. My sense of the stories and also the data is that everywhere you see statistics that are also depressing, there are also that slim minority. And in a way, the book is actually about a very slim minority of working women, and yet the fact that they get up and they work, and that's an act of resistance. I mean, it may not seem like it, but they're every day going out and fighting patriarchy just by earning an income and deciding how to spend it on their own terms. They want to watch it on a Shah Rukh film. They want to buy a phone for themselves. So I'm optimistic, and my sense is that television continues. I do want to say one thing, which is, and there's data on this in the book, which is I think we tend to believe, I think where we operate, that OTT and internet is the way to go, but television continues to be the dominant way women particularly interact with media, and they are watching TV at least every week, and the internet access actually continues to be much lesser. And there's a wonderful set of, I think there's a lot of research done, published by Film Companion, done by Ormax Media Group. Those who are interested, I'd encourage them to go look it up. Essentially what they find is that men spend many more hours on OTT platforms.
Hi, I can't wait to read the book, but what I'm very curious to know is you speak about in your interviews and even here today how Shah Rukh Khan has kind of tweaked the notion of masculinity, has changed that idea. So how has that impacted queer men and their ideas of masculinity? Has it made masculinity more accessible to perform?
That's such a great question. And one of the things I'm really hoping, because the book, and in fact the first line in the book is that my life, much like the lives I think many of the women in the book have been heteronormative hell, because it's written from a very hetero mating market perspective, and I do want to be transparent about that. But I will say this, everywhere that I met women who loved Shah Rukh Khan, I met men who did not like him at all. And you see this in the book, that in fact fathers, brothers, there's this constant nagging of the younger woman to say, why do you like this guy? And even now in the current moment that we're in, I think many of us have seen the kinds of things that were said, and it's a lot of young men and older men who don't seem to like him. I joke that he's been making South Asian men feel inadequate since 1992, and I'll stick to that. But I do think what he's done is, in a way, traditional masculinity, certainly in the north and also certain parts of the east, if I think of a Jharkhand or Bihar states I know well, what is, a man is supposed to always be in control, reserved, and there's that stoic reserved masculinity. Shah Rukh is the exact opposite of that. He's always weeping, he's speaking his feelings, and he's weeping in the movies, I should add, and not in real life. And yet, when I think a lot of men who have been socialized into accepting that mode of masculinity for themselves, when they see this man, they react. One, I think it makes them uncomfortable about many of the norms that you've inherited. And I've had conversations like these. Someday maybe I'll write a short companion, just paper perhaps, because I don't think there's enough material on it for a book, but just how men reacted to him as well. And absolutely, I think there's a lot of literature, certainly in film studies, about how for gay men, the fact that he used to also openly joke at people who made fun of homosexual men, because there were a lot of jokes about his own sexuality. And he, in fact, as opposed to feeling ashamed of it, completely owned it in a way. And he said, yeah, you want to joke about this? There's nothing shameful in being gay, and you want to say that I am, and I'm not, but I think it's perfectly, he made it almost cool that it was fine. And I think a lot of men I interact with felt very, very, they felt connected to that. They felt that has made a cultural shift in the way I think queer masculinity operates. So yes, I do think that he's made a very different kind of masculinity available. I have a line in the book, I call him the patron saint of South Asia and metrosexuals. because I think metrosexuality essentially became a thing because of him, the way he dressed, his modes, the dupatta that he would wear even in songs, and suddenly one started seeing men at weddings all over Punjab wearing dupattas, which is interesting, right? And so yeah, I absolutely agree with you, but I don't think I have enough material to say anything in depth, and my hope is some scholars or others will take that on in the future. Thanks.
Thanks.
Good evening. It was quite interesting to know that a woman like Shah Rukh more than Salman. I didn't know this. Okay, but my question is totally different. It's about women empowerment and the labor market. You touched upon this topic.
Go closer to the mic, please.
You touched upon this topic. You specified that women work more in the house than men, and they get paid, they don't get paid at the same time. Yeah. So earlier in Jan this year, Supreme Court stated that women's household work is equivalent to the office-going men's work. So my question is that about this unpaid work, is it going to materialize for women in the future?
That's a great question. There's actually a small, I think, historical anecdote in the book, which is a discussion between Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Nehru about women's role in the economy. And what they're arguing about fundamentally is she's saying the economy is the home care. So she was, as we know, extremely supportive of home-based industries, crafts, because she understood that care was a fulcrum of the economy and of work. And she says to Nehru, women don't need protection, they need attention. And I think there was the word protection that was used in some clause. And they were fighting about that. And so this is a battle that's been going on even following the change in the legislation in maternity rights, because now we do have more maternity benefits. And yet they only apply to a very small share of the formal workforce. Most of the women in the book who come from the informal economy do not have access to any of those. They do not also have access to any valuation of their unpaid work. My sense is, while I'm aware of the judgment, and it's a fantastic judgment in the text of it, operationalizing it, because my other hat, I work on social protection, cash transfers, how do you provide these benefits to people? The big challenge is going to be, how do you start to monetize something like that? How do you decide at what notions and structures will you start to make these transfers? In fact, during Manmohan Singh's regime, when he was prime minister, this idea was actually floated then as well, and then shot down, this idea of giving cash transfers to women simply for housework, which is extremely productive. In the book, I have estimates on what share of the GDP is actually coming through care labor. But I'm not sure that we will actually start to see this operation. I think there's a notion increasingly between a Supreme Court judgment, perhaps we'll see further modifications in certain acts. Actually operationalizing it as cash transfers and providing support to women, I think is going to be very difficult. My sense is to do, unless we do a universal transfer to all women, which is, I mean, we heard about that, and then right now, no one's really even talking about income support anymore. So I'm hopeful more on the way the private sector will probably internalize some of these norms in protecting female workers and their jobs. I'm unsure about valuing unpaid work in a concrete way through cash or through transfers to women. Thank you.
We are running out of time. So what we'll do is, we have two people waiting here and one online question we wish to ask. We'll ask all of them together and you could answer them in one go. So Lekha, could you get the Nitila question asked?
Nitila actually has several questions. I'm going to summarize it. She asked if you've been following the interesting, iconic idols from South Korea who are taking the conversation of the boldly androgynous, sensitive man further on a global stage, about boys in love with women for the complexity of who they are. Nitila is tuning in from Princeton, she says. And she's also intrigued by Manu's question about the kind of masculinity Mammootty and Mohanlal embody that continues to be attractive for men. So are women's desire for intimacy fulfilled by icons or idols that may not be nominally attractive to men and their understanding of strength?
Oh, thanks. We'll take all the three questions together. Please ask your question.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Nandana. So the question I had is related to gold, not the character, but the commodity gold. So in India, especially as somebody who comes from Kerala, we are all so obsessed with gold, especially women, since you give birth to a girl child, you are so obsessed with buying gold for her, you save up for her marriage. And once they do get married, that's kind of the only savings that they have, or the kind of only way in which they interact with money, or the only agency that they possess as well. So I was just curious as to know if that features in your book, and as an economist, how do you see that as well?
Yeah, hello. Staying alone in Bangalore, I could not relate more with the topic that you're talking about right now. My question is, like all millennials, I'm also on Bumble, and I have found more Salmans than Shah Rukhs. Okay, what do you think is the strategic problem with? Yeah. So the thing is, what do you think is actually wrong with the society, or I wouldn't say wrong, or what is the scenario? Why is it even 50 years back there were more Salmans, and even down with my generation there is still more Salmans and less of Shah Rukhs?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Quickly. I think to the answer to the lady from Princeton, I lost her name. Mithila. No, the idea is that they're not just drawn to a masculinity which is idealized, but the idealized, as we know from religion as well, the idealized gives voice to then real expectations. You create benchmarks. So the way, and in fact, just as the young lady right now just said, what I would constantly hear is we have a type of man who is like Shah Rukh, and then we have a type of man who's like Salman. And I think what they're doing actually is they're creating this idealized construct so that from there they can safely critique what is around them and the kinds of behaviors in men which they're not openly allowed to critique, particularly in the North. And they could critique it through saying, well, why are these men not like Shah Rukh? Why don't you dress like him? Why don't you behave like him? Why don't you talk like him? So I think that's one. On gold, in fact, the reason the character in that chapter is called gold is because of gold, because of the commodity gold, because when she runs away from home, when she runs away from home, she takes the jewelry that she was supposed to take for her marriage, and she uses that actually to, so you're absolutely right, gold continues to be a very important asset. Having said that, we should recognize land continues to be the most important asset in the country, and there's a lot of data in the book about what's happened to women's access to land. In fact, it was during the pandemic that the Supreme Court clarified that the changes that had been made by Mr. Manmohan Singh's government that allowed for women to inherit land apply to women who have been born before that amendment. So it's actually only now that things are even more clear. And the fact that we're talking about women's access to land now gives you a sense of what's happening in the landscape. And men have access to more assets, but gold continues to be so. And I think to your question, I'm going to give you, unfortunately, a technocratic answer, and I have many other things to say about Shah Rukh and Salman, and you should read the book. What I will say is all the data that feminist economists have produced shows rigorous data and sociological ethnographic data. Both are rigorous. What I meant was quantitative data and sociological ethnographic data. Let me correct myself. Tells us that sons of women who are working tend to have what we would define as more progressive values. And my hope is that's what we sort of mean when we say someone is like Shah Rukh and someone is like Salman, right? And what happens is, I write about this in the book, that when mothers are working, young men grow up realizing that this woman doesn't exist just for my needs and she doesn't breathe for my service. And she has an autonomy and sovereignty that is all her own, and I have to then make trade-offs and bargains with that. And they grow up with that, and there's so much literature, particularly right now coming out of the Harvard Business School as well, looking at intergenerational effects. So my sincere hope is, I don't know what the landscape of Bumble is going to look like, but I think the fact, I'm assuming you're a working woman, and I hope at some point if you have kids, they will certainly grow up to be more Shah Rukh than Salman. Having said that, right now I should say that Salman is a big hit with the Shah Rukh fan clubs these days because of the great support that he apparently has provided during this moment. So maybe, but the binary I understand, and I think it's intergenerational. I think that's all I can say to you. And about...
One more point to it also, like Salman's usually are the ground reality, like uncles also like a fan.
I'm in so much trouble. I think these terms are going to stick, and people are. My father once said to me that once his book is out, you'll have to leave the country and go to France. But I will say that I think it has because when we talk about these issues around gender, it's not just about men versus women, right? Who's raising these boys to be this way? It's intimate relationships, and all the literature tells us social change is intimate and it's incremental, and the home is very fundamental to a lot of these what we call change in attitudes, right? We talk about it very glibly, but I think in the book I'm trying to give you a flavor of that. And my hope is that as more women are stepping out of the home and young men see that, things start to change in the way they also behave in the romantic persona of theirs as well. And they should all watch Shah Rukh. I think it is recommended everyone should be put through a Shah Rukh regime of films.
Janhavi, closing comments. I mean, we have any closing comments, and we can close.
Well, I must say that I mentioned something.
The mic, use the mic.
I must say I mentioned something on those lines to Shrayana when I called her, the first call we had about this event, and a similar anecdote from
You're going to get into more trouble.
I know, a similar anecdote from Bangalore's dating markets from one of my friends who is in this room. And she said, in my book, those men are called walking, talking contraceptives. So read the book.
Read the book if you want to know about what walking, talking contraceptives means.
Okay. So thank you so much. We are out of time, and thank you, Shrayana. Thank you, Manu. Thank you, Janhavi, for doing this. The government.